Hello and welcome to the List Makers. I'm Dave.
And I'm Rob.
And on this Doctor Who show spin-off, we're going to put together some lists. This is List Maker episode 43, Top 5 Stories, where the Doctor overthrows the government. Rob, you ready to go?
I am ready to go, Dave. I think we'll have a good discussion about this one when we're done.
I think so. Are you feeling this will be a snappy episode or a bit distinct? Last time we had no snaps.
My gut feeling is snaps, actually.
Yeah, I think that could be the case. But hopefully I've got a couple of different ones to you, but we'll find out soon. Rob, it's your turn to make a list. As usual, I won't interrupt you. What have you got for us?
All right, Dave. In at number 5, I've got the Christmas Invasion. And I often start with a cheat or something weird in my number 5 slot. And in this story, of course, fan favourite Harriet Jones returns. She blew up the Sycorax spaceship, and the Doctor's absolute disgust at that led to the "Don't you think she looks tired?" line, which then plants the seed of doubt in her prime ministership, and next minute she's facing the rumours of ill health and a vote of no confidence. But, you might legitimately cry, that wasn't an overthrow of the government. You know, they were just changing prime minister. And you're right, but I think the way that Harold Saxon then rolls in the timeline and takes government at the next election, I think that rapid destabilisation of Jones and no doubt the instability of her government caused that government to be punted, meaning in effect the Doctor did overthrow that government, maybe just the long way round.
Interesting. Okay.
In at number 4, I've got The Savages. Maybe not top of mind for people because it's a bit of a lost story, but the basic premise is that once the Doctor and his pals decide to help the Savages and do something about the Elders, the Doctor realises the Elders are really going to need to be forced out, not just persuaded, to change their ways and basically the whole civilization, let alone what just passes for government there. It all needs to change. And so begins, the destruction of the technology underpinning the society, and it ends the oppression of the Savages and so on. So this is basically the Doctor and his pals as revolutionaries. It's a strange and yet I think quite neat ending for Stephen too. One of my favourite companions, staying behind as a mediator between the parties. So yeah, again, maybe not a story people would think of for this list with the whole it's missing angle and maybe they've never read The Target or whatever, I don't know. But I think it's solid.
Nice.
In at number 3, I've got Vengeance on Varos. A bit of a different one here because although the Doctor and Peri end up in a place that's quite horrible and you think, gosh, things have to change here, and in the end we do get that change, it's through the very different method of them working with the governor and stopping Syl from taking over Varos that change is effected. And I think that's quite interesting. You have the governor who's born into the elite of society. He's born to rule. And the resolution to this isn't his head on a stake or being tarred and feathered and run out of town, but he uses his power to change the society. So while the government doesn't change per se, or the leadership doesn't change per se, the way it operates and the society it's governing does change. So the status quo is overthrown, but without changing the head honcho. And I think that's quite interesting.
Nice.
In at number 2, I've got The Happiness Patrol. And I realise people are listening right now probably having a bottom-clenching moment, oh, how can he say The Happiness Patrol at number 2? Isn't that the toppermost of the poppermost, when it comes to the Doctor overthrowing governments? And sure, it's one of the biggies and it deserves to be here in the list. It's at number 2. But I do have one more that I think is better. But for this story, there's just so much to dig into. The Helen A. Thatcher impression, that can't go unmentioned. There's more than a little gay subtext. The general vibe of this isn't Doctor Who as we know it. Yet there's also so much in there which is what Doctor Who had been all along. It's one of those stories that you watch and wish Doctor Who had continued production and we'd got the odd story like this from year to year. It's good and it deserves to be here based on the premise of him overthrowing the government in it.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, at number 1, I'm throwing in Genesis of the Daleks. Now, you all thought I was going to say the Sunmakers, right? Well, I don't know if you were, but maybe you were. But I prefer this. We get the sense that the Khaleds in Genesis are living under some kind of militaristic, totalitarian type regime. We don't really get into a lot of background there, but I believe it's fleshed out in the I, Davros series from Big Finish. And that's one of those I must listen to it one day things, and I believe, Dave, you've recently bought it yourself.
So. I have, so I've now moved it from bought to must listen to.
Mm-hmm.
When that next stage happens, we'll see.
Yeah. I know enough about it to know it has characters like the Supremo, who is the leader of the Khaled nation. And all of that governing structure is actually, in effect, blown away at the end of Genesis, even though we don't know that name in Genesis. Retroactively, we know that, well, he must be one of the people who gets blown away at the end of Genesis. So we have, in Genesis, Davros raving that the Khaled race has ended, but the Daleks are going to rise from the ashes. So the Doctor just doesn't overthrow the government here. He sees it obliterated and replaced with something quite new in the form of the Daleks, which is a bit of a whoopsie. But there you go. And that's my 5, Dave. That's my 5.
That's your 5. We have a snap.
Okay.
I'll get on with making my list, then we can have a bit of a chat and see what we've both done. Number 5, I've also gone with a missing story, but I've gone with the Macra Terror.
Oh, okay.
Because this is a story where the Doctor and his companions rock into this colony world. Everything seems nice, but you slowly learn that there's something sinister crawling away under the surface. You suddenly realise that all of the economy and all of the structure of this colony is all about serving the Macra. And it's the Doctor who brings it all down. He frees the colonists, he gets rid of the Macra, and he turns the whole thing on its head. And again, it's a missing story, although now animated, and it's one that I don't think comes to mind that often, but I thought it was very worth putting in on this list.
Nice.
Number 4. You know what? I reckon that's better than 4. I'm going to make that 3.
Ooh, controversial.
And so number 4, I'm now going to say the Happiness Patrol.
Okay.
Like you, Rob, I think this certainly had to be on the list, but I also don't think that it's the best example out there. And perhaps this is a very good example of where the archetype, whilst good and whilst an archetype, is very basic and very simple in what it does. This is obviously, the famous one. The McCoy Doctor comes in overnight, he overthrows the government, and this is what the Doctor does. And it is interesting to watch the way in which the Doctor does it, because for most of the story, he doesn't actually remove Helena per se. He removes the apparatus of power. He removes, if you like, the secret police and the military and the bureaucracy by removing people like the Candyman, Priscilla P, Daisy K. Taking those people out and removing them from around Helena then means that effectively she has no power structure. And that's a really interesting take, but I think a very basic take. Unlike number 3, which I'm now saying is full circle.
Oh, okay.
Because this is a case of the Doctor not coming in necessarily throwing over an evil dictatorship or an oppressive, murderous regime. No, the Deciders aren't oppressive and they aren't murderous and they aren't wicked. They're just failing. They're just flawed. And the Doctor doesn't overthrow the government by removing them from power. The Doctor overthrows the government by changing a fundamental part of their society, giving them information on how to launch the ship, and then letting them change their form of government, letting them change the way they approach the government. So were the people in the government changed? No. But was the nature of the government changed? And was the nature of society fundamentally changed because of that? Yes. They're no longer stuck on Alzerius. They're now on board the Styliner heading to wherever they're going to head to. A double header, appropriately, for number 2 on my list.
Okay.
And that is the Keys of Marinus. Because the Doctor doesn't overthrow one government, he overthrows 2. First of all, he comes in, and over the course of an episode, or I should probably say Barbara, really, the TARDIS crew, overthrow the Morpho Brains and free the city of Morphoton. So, look, you talk about McCoy's Doctor doing it all in the space of 3 episodes overnight. Barbara does it in the space of a morning, just over 1 episode. So, look, I think that's a really good example, and that is a very oppressive, driven regime that is made slaves of the population, and they're taken out, and that's a really good thing. But then you get to the end of the story, and the Doctor and Ian make a decision to destroy the conscience machine, and that is meant to govern and supervise the whole of the populations of Marinus. And the Doctor says man was not meant to be ruled by machines, and fundamentally changes the way they've applied government to Marinus. So it's a double header there. I think there are 2 forms of government overthrown in the Keys of Marinus.
Very nice.
Number 1, look, this is the one you said had to be up there, and it is my number 1. It is the Sunmakers.
Yeah.
I think this is a glorious story. It's funny, it's witty, it's an adventure that pokes little daggers at the regime, at the government, at the company. It is Robert Holmes angry that he got too big a tax bill and having a go at the government. And I've often said, what do Robert Holmes and George Harrison have in common? They both got a massive tax bill and wrote some artwork about it.
Yeah.
So I think it's up there. But again, the method in which the Doctor does it, I think, is really important, because this is an example of the Doctor not so much taking out the regime himself and by force or anything like that, but giving the population the ability to do it themselves, giving them the chance to breathe clean air, putting in a couple of messages on the machine to just nudge them along. But in the end, it's the population that choose to change direction. It's the population that take out the collector and the gatherer. You get wonderful moments like when Marn is confronted by the mob and sort of says, hey, I elect to join the revolution, which is, very classic of that sort of middle order that just sort of, well, okay, we'll just move with the swaying forces now. So there's a lot of really good stuff going on, but it's just an entertaining story that is fundamentally all about the Doctor changing the government.
Absolutely. And if we can get into the discussion now, I'll start by saying, of course, the Sunmakers could have been on my list, but I was trying to throw in some quirky stuff here and there. And I'll start by mentioning Vengeance on Varos, which I think has similarities to Full Circle, insofar as it's not so much an overthrow of the government, but just a change of how things are going to be done going forward.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'll say at this point, two of yours, although not snaps, were on my shortlist, and that is Vengeance on Varos and it is The Savages. So we were both thinking about those ones. I couldn't quite get them in my 5, you did, but definitely similar ideas there. And I think you're right about Varos. Although the governor himself is still in charge, the system of government has changed. Yeah. My problem is that it's not the Doctor that does it. The Doctor just runs around the punishment dome for 90 odd minutes, and then Syl gets an emergency telex from his boss that says the economic factors have changed, and that changes the whole dynamic. So I think the government does change, but did the Doctor do it?
Yeah, I see that. I do see that. But, I think him being there still assists the narrative.
Yes. Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, for sure. I was being a little bit facetious for the purposes of conversation.
I know.
The snap we only had one snap, and that was the Happiness Patrol. Expected, I think.
Yes, that was the one I thought, we'll definitely snap on that, because how can you not have it? And I thought, being a Hartnell fan, you would probably go the Savages route. Yeah,
I came very close, but I already had Keys of Marinus in there, and Macra Terror as well. And I do like the Macra Terror because of the fundamental way in which the government changes the lives of the people on that colony. I think that it's a story that's very forgotten. Even with the animation being out, I don't think it's a particularly well-known story. And if you say to sort of a fan who hasn't seen it or hasn't seen a lot of it, what do you know about the Macra Terror? It's the one with the giant crabs, isn't it? Yeah. It's not the one where the Doctor frees a colony. And so I thought it was worth highlighting, but I absolutely get why the Savages was worth highlighting, and it was on my list as well. But yeah, the Happiness Patrol is about the Doctor changing a government. It's a very abstract story as well. I mean, let's be honest. In the Sunmakers, it's all about taxation and oppressing the workers through a very real-world type thing. The same with the Keys of Marinus. The Morpho Brains, although they're using weird sci-fi technology to do the oppressing, they're doing a very traditional oppressive stuff, slave ownership and all the rest of that. I mean, Happiness Patrol, it uses the idea of you have to be happy, which is a absurd idea, but it uses that absurd idea to tell a story, and that I think is very clever and very interesting, but it does take away from its application to the real world, maybe.
Whereas something that I think is very much of the real world, and you expressed some surprise at it, I think, was my Christmas Invasion pick, because I do think that Harriet Jones government, or the government that came after her, would have been quite unstable and was ripe for Harold Saxon to sort of pick on. So that's why I went there.
Yeah. All right. So let me give you the timeline over the course of about 15 seconds. When you first mentioned it, my initial reaction was, "Oh, really?" Because I have I get very irritated at the sort of the undergraduate student politics way in which Russell T Davies thinks he's doing something very clever. Doesn't she look tired? And then that leads to the collapse of the government. I just go, oh, come on, that's not how it works. That's a bit pathetic, really. But then when you explained that does lead to a change of government and that power vacuum that the Doctor creates is directly responsible for the Master as Harold Saxon taking over the government.
Yeah.
I thought, hey, Rob, well done. Well done. You've surprised me there, and I see where you've come from. That's very, very cool. So I started off with Rob and ended up with Rob.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I wasn't looking at it so much directly, but sort of like adjacent to what did this affect? What was the knock-on effect, really, of this?
Yeah, and interestingly, there's something very particular about the Christmas invasion on our list, Rob.
Mm-hmm.
Only New Who story.
Yeah, it is actually.
I just realised that. I hadn't even realised that my list was 5 classics, and indeed my extended list was 7 classics. So between us, we've got only one New Who story, which is interesting because given that New Who, in different ways under different showrunners, has always had this, it's very political, sort of vibe about it and the conversation about it, it's not the one that we went through and said, well, this is where the Doctor does political things and overthrows the government. It was almost all classic series, and going through it spread right across the classic series. We've got a couple of Hartnells, we've got a Troughton, we've got a couple of Toms, we've got a McCoy, we've got a sixth Doctor. Yeah, it's pretty evenly spread across the 7 classic Doctors.
It is. And one question that was in my head when I was making all these choices is like, what is government? Like, even in Vengeance on Varos, it's like a governor. Like, is that really the government, or is the government somewhere else and he's just the governor of this outpost? And so I was struggling with what makes up a government. And in a lot of New Who, the Doctor might overthrow some sort of quotation marks regime, but is it the government? So I was kind of getting tripped up on that word from time to time. Yeah,
I think that's right. I certainly chose to cast the net fairly widely and not be too prescriptive. I mean, I'm not saying that the Macra are the government, but they were the regime. They were the controlling force.
Yeah.
The deciders, very loosely maybe could you call them a government, but they're certainly the governing system of that society. So yeah, I think there were some really good, interesting paths that we were both able to go down there. And look, I think listeners would have walked into this and said, okay, well, the Sunmakers has got to be on there, the Happiness Patrol has got to be on there. And yeah, they were.
Yeah. But
hopefully we've got some other different takes in there as well. But I'm going to be pondering for a while now why we didn't have more New Who. Did we miss something obvious, or is it just not quite what New Who does?
I'm going to have to pull out the lists and just see what's on there. And
yeah. But we're out of time, so it is now time to turn to the Hat of Rassilon.
You're back at home this time.
I'm back at home this time, yes. So, this has come in from 2 different listeners, both with the same idea. Thank you to Peter Kavanagh and Blaine Coughlin for submitting top 5 stories that should have been a regeneration story for that Doctor.
Oh, golly.
That's a tough one.
Oh, dear, Yep.
That's a tough one, but that's next month's problem. Until then, I've been Dave.
And I've been Rob.
And we'll make some more lists next month.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.